Hello everybody, welcome to another Coffee Tip Wednesday where our goal is to help you create cafe quality coffee at home. And today is all about water. How much water should we drink every day? Okay, so let's talk about water. If you're drinking coffee, you know that your coffee is roughly 98% water. So it's one thing, we talk a lot about coffee and the beans and all that, but really a majority of what we're drinking is actually just water. So we need to spend some time in talking about the water and how that impacts the flavor of the coffee we're drinking, and maybe time for us to start stepping up our water game a little bit. So let's look at a couple of terminology items that we need to understand with water. The first thing is TDS. So a lot of times you'll hear TDS in water, which means total dissolved solids. Now, if you buy like a Brita water filter or a Zero, I think it's Zero Water will give you this free little TDS because their thing is that they're reducing all of the junk in the water and you can actually measure the total dissolved solids and it should read 0 after you run the filter. Now, that is not necessarily a good thing when it comes to coffee because it is part of those minerals that help us actually brew coffee. So when it comes to total dissolved solids, if we're going to measure our water, so we generally want a range between 120 to 130 parts per million of total dissolved minerals in our water. So a good quality mineral water. So if the TDS is too low, we get really unrefined flavors, the coffee lacks mouthfeel. Essentially, there's not enough solids to actually extract the flavors out of the coffee and into our cup. Now, if there is too many solids in our water, if the minerality of the water is too high, we start to get a really dull and kind of muddled flavor in our coffee. So ideally we want around 120 to 130 parts per million. So for a long time what I was doing is with espresso, I was filling my water tank with distilled water and then I was adding minerals back into it so that I was always at 120 to 130 parts per million. However, I'm in Golden, Colorado, and we have pretty decent water here, especially once it's filtered. And so I was achieving roughly that mineral rate without having to go through such a tedious process. So I've kind of stuck with just a good filtered water out of the tap. Let's also talk about the acidity of the water or the alkalinity of the water. So generally we want our water to be right at 7, so right in the middle of that pH scale. If the water is too acidic, if it's too high, the coffee becomes very dull. And if the acidity is lower, if the water is more alkaline, it becomes really bright and really acidic and kind of a little too intense for our cup, in our cup. And you can also pick up a pH meter if you really are interested. I think I have one somewhere, and you can actually look at the acidity of your water as well. I haven't really messed too much with acidity other than when making a few coffee products, trying to measure the acidity of the finished beverage for bottling because you want a certain pH when you bottle things, and that's basically for shelf life. But other than that, I haven't really messed with acidity too much. So the other thing we're going to look at is the hardness of the water. How hard is our water? And now hardness of the water generally refers to both calcium and magnesium ions. So these are the things that kind of will also scale up our machine if our water's too hard. As the water heats up, they kind of create that scale inside of our machine. But it also helps in the extraction process. Now, we generally want a hardness of around 70 to 80 milligrams per liter of both calcium and magnesium. And generally, if it's too low, then the coffee will be a little thin. It lacks any real structure or body, so kind of pulling the oils or the weight of the coffee into the cup. And if it's too high, it can then become kind of chalky, right? So imagine a lot of calcium. If you've ever had a Tums, like that chalkiness, that will start to impart in the water. So a lot of times there's a few cafes that are really good that have these really cool water filtration systems underneath that in some places soften the water, so pull out that calcium and magnesium ions out of the water. And then we have some that maybe need to add some in because it's too hard. Interesting enough, I had a good friend of mine who was living in India, and he brought a coffee back from India. And what we found is that when we brewed the coffee here, it just lacked any of that structure. It wasn't acidic, it wasn't bright, it just wasn't that great. But once we added some more minerals to the water, once we made the water a little harder, then actually the coffee started to taste better. So what's interesting is though, when you look at coffee, like a coffee roaster in India is going to have to roast their coffees different based on what the water structure is like in their area, and bring it here, it may be not such a great coffee until you can manipulate that water. So to kind of wrap this thing up, water is very important, but I also feel that you don't have to get too crazy with it. If you do pick up like a zero water filter, definitely take advantage of the TDS meter and just maybe measure the water coming out of your tap once you filter it. I generally recommend filtering the water if you can, to try to remove as much chlorine and fluoride out of the water as you can, because we don't want those chemicals messing with the coffee. I don't know scientifically how much of an impact they have on the coffee, but if we can remove them, we might as well. But then also measure it just to kind of see if you could just start with what your TDS is in your water, it will give you a good starting point. So if I'm starting to really get into coffee and exploring how good of a cup of coffee I can make, the majority of it is water, let's start with a good base. So filter your tap water, then give it a measure and see if it has enough solids in there to kind of make a good cup of coffee. Now, especially if it's low and you are working with a coffee, sometimes maybe a little darker coffee will work a little better because it's more water soluble. So you may go with a little darker coffee. However, if you're trying to go for a more well-developed coffee, as we talked in our light versus dark roast comparison, then you want to get away from those kind of caramelized sugary flavors and that roasty, ashy flavor, then it's time to start thinking about manipulating your water. One thing that you could look at is getting a jug of distilled water and then there's a company called Third Wave Water, and they actually make these little packets that if you add that to distilled water should get you the numbers that we were talking about today. And they have different ones for espresso and filter or drip coffee, that sort of thing. So again, with water, it's a majority of what we drink. Start to look at it, play with your water, see how it affects the coffee that you're drinking, and have more fun with it. If you have any questions or comments, definitely leave those below. And if you felt that this video was helpful, please hit the subscribe button, hit the little notification bell so that you find out, you always get notified when a new video comes out. This just helps me to create more content and to help create content that's important to you, and so I know what you guys want to hear. So as always, coffee, pedal, repeat. Feed.